Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session of the ETC reading group on writing orality. I'm very glad to that we have a lot of people here today as well. And so for those who are new, this reading group is about retrieving traces of orality in different early text cultures, early and medieval text cultures. And so far we have focused on formulaic language, the sound of orality, and then last week we have focused on the textual strategy for writing orality, and today we are going to focus on layers of orality. So before I introduce our first speakers, let me just quickly go through the ground rules, which I'm sharing in the chat. So I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with them by now, but for those who are new, they're very straightforward. We kindly ask you to mute your mic during the talks and during the joint session, so there will be no Q&A between the talks. We ask you to write either a new question or follow up in the chat room. And then please wait until I call out your name, and then you can directly speak to one of the speakers. However, if you don't feel comfortable in speaking on screen, you can type the full question in the chat, and I will read it out loud for you. Right. Okay. So that's done. Let me introduce our first speaker, Yeogeun Kim, who is a DPhil in Oriental Studies, and her thesis explores various translation of Korean traditional literary works and art. And she also has publications which examine audience experience in relation to the materiality of text as object, with a focus on comparative engagements between various texts and artifacts, films and performance. And today she's going to tell us about a 17th century Korean literary text and compare it to the poetry of the Tang Dynasty. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Soo Kim.
Hi. Let me just share my screen first. So, can you hear me? Yes. So today I want to talk about writing orality, in particular layers of orality with Harry. So first, the novel I look at, I might need to explain a bit of the novel. I'm not sure actually you read the handout I sent you in advance, but anyway, I want to explain a bit. So the novel I discussed today is Ku Unmong. It means it has a 3-syllable Ku Unmong. So the first syllable means 9, second means a cloud, and last one means dream. So it's basically dream narrative of 9 characters. So Kumong was first written by Kim Man-jung, the Korean nobleman, but it's first written by him in between 1687 to 1688. So the original text actually is going back to 17th century, but his manuscript not survived. So the earliest datable version is actually 1725. So the text I'm gonna address today, actually it's 1725 version. So the reason I chose this version is because it's printed, so it's datable, and also it's claimed, it's not never proven, but actually scholars argue that this version is most widely circulated and most influential to other versions, means that it's most popular version. And then the literary works it's composed 17th century, and the version I look at is 18th century. But the story actually it's set in 9th century China. So this is important for my presentation today because the novel has a lot of poetry in the narrative. And then those poetry mostly from Tang poems. So this is important because the poetry, as you see, is recitable, right? The poetry is a vocal music back then, and it has a lot of functions. But the Korean audience, Chinese is not their mother tongue, but they know Chinese, but they don't speak Chinese every day and daily life, but they use Chinese to write. And then they have a different pronunciation of Chinese, but they do know the versification. I mean, how to rhyme the poetry and things like that. But in addition to the technical issues, I mean, poetry compared to, for example, English poetry, in East Asia, I mean, China, Korea, Japan, poetry often played so many different roles, meaning so it has social functions, sometimes public functions, not just to personal enjoyment. So often poetry composed at a social gatherings and in public context. And then that kind of the roles associated with the poetry, in particular here, Tang poetry, may not maintained for a Korean audience in 17th century or 18th or 19th century, but they recite poetry. That means that at least the orality, some orality of poetry actually available for them. And then, but in the novel, the so far I explained the orality associated with the Tang poetry. It's not just recitation. It also has a lot of other functions, like socially and publicly and politically sometimes. But those functions actually very richly kept in the narrative, the poetry we look at in the novel. So there's somehow some kind of differences. I mean, in the real life, the audience may not have all this rich orality of the poetry, but in the novel, actually there are a lot kept, maintained in the novel. So that's somehow differences there. So I don't think I need to explain the story, but basically it's a Buddhist monk met 8 ladies, and then he fall in love, and then he punished for that. And you know the Buddhism a bit. I mean, he reborn as a Confucian scholar in Tang society, and he meets again 8 ladies, and then he get a good life. And then, but eventually he realized that this is all his dream, and then he goes back to the monastery and become a very renowned monk. So the episode I look at today is he meets again with one of his ladies. And then at their encounter, poetry plays a very significant role in making their rendezvous or their meet up happens. So the protagonist's name is Soyu, and the novel has two names. I mean, the monk has a different name, but Soyu here is the Confucian scholar reborn in Tang Dynasty. So Soyu, and the woman's name is Chaebong. So Soyu's first the meets with one of his women, Chaebong, and then when they meet, so he writes poems, but in the novel it said that he writes, but we then probably he just recite the poem from top of his head. But often in Tang poetry, it's not like modern poems. I mean, they just how to say, improvise their poetry, and then they just on the spot they recite it, and then the audience just receive it at usually it's a kind of social gathering context. Anyway, he writes a poem about the beauty of the willow and recites them. But in the novel, the message of the poetry is not delivered to the woman. Actually, his voice be heard by the woman. Actually, his voice is more important than the message of the poetry. So the novel describes the spring breeze takes his voice up to the pavilion where a woman, Chaebong, is taking a nap. She wakes up at the sound and looks around, wondering where the voice comes from. Then their eyes encounter each other. So here is the orality of poetry is really key. In making them meet each other. So it's one of the paintings depict the story. I mean, just for your pleasure, for viewing pleasure, I just put up this painting here. And also my thesis compare this text and image. So that's why I know a lot of these images here. So I mean, usually the image I look at is multi-panel screens, and it's one of the screens here. This describes what happens when they encounter. So this guy at the bottom left is Soyu, the Confucian scholar, and he recites the poem about the willow tree. And then the Chaebong up there, the woman, actually looks down at the guy. So that's the way it described the painting. So now the poetry, there are many poetry, but I only discuss two poems here. So the willow poetry is usually called willow tree poems, because it's about willow tree. So I'm gonna read the poetry first. So of a lush willow tree hanging over like fabric, their long branches touch a luxurious pavilion. Please plant more of this willow diligently, as this tree is the best for tasteful enjoyment of scenery. How green a willow tree it is! Long branches touch brightly colored pillars. Please dare not cut them, as this tree is the most lovable. So I'm not sure actually how much you know about the Tang poetry, but here this poetry, one type of Tang poetry is 4 lines, and each line has 5 characters. So this is actually 2 poems. So first one is 1 poem, and second another poem. And I don't want to explain the rhyme or versification a lot, but actually there is very regulated poetry. So you should know how to write. I mean, the rulable rhymes and all things like that, like English poems or the other European language poems. So and then these poems actually, I mean, it's really Tang poetry. So it's observed all versification and rhyme rules. So then that's my key points for my presentation. So when you look at this poetry, first, orality in text performed by characters in the novel. So here the two poems I just explained is performed by the protagonist Soyu. But this orality is a Chinese poetry. But the second, but the text actually when the people read the novel, it's usually read out loud. So text recited by audiences. So means that the novel actually is, there is a prose section and there's a lot of poetry in there. And then when you recite a novel, you recite the prose and at the same time, Chinese poetry. So then that means that when you recite the novel, usually, although it's written in Chinese, actually the novel, there's two different versions. I don't want to confuse you, but usually before 20th century, popular novel Korean popular novels, there are two versions, Korean and vernacular Korean and Chinese versions for the same novel. So Gumong is not exceptional. So Gumong also has Korean version and Chinese version. The version I look at today is Chinese version. But when you read, actually you read not in Chinese, but sometimes in Chinese. But often you translate, I mean, on your own. So when you recite, particularly to others, other audiences, you translate. Means that prose recite in Korean, but they never translate poetry. Means that you recite the poetry in Chinese. And so there's a different oralities goes with different languages. And it also goes, it also complicated, I mean, depending on your familiarity with the Chinese poetry or the Chinese references or things like that. So usually the popular novels are read a lot by women, not always women, but a lot by women. So they usually read out. So, but not just for individual reading, usually in the market, at the lower left, there's a guy with a fan in his hand. Actually, he's not reading the book to himself. Actually, he reading from the book, recite the story from the book to his audience around him. So usually it happened in the market to the less educated people. Then I think for personal reading, probably the orality of the text play a different role from when you recite the text to the audience, not just to yourself. Also, the novel I look at is, I said it's actually there's a lot of Chinese references and heavily influenced by Chinese novel. And also I said that there's two different versions. But there is another type of Korean novel, which is entirely indigenous tradition, indigenous oral tradition. And actually, I don't know, you may have heard of this, but it's called Panzori. And it's, I think it's simply put, it's kind of opera. So it's a very lengthy vernacular storytelling. The reason I mentioned this vernacular novel, because it's verse and it's performed, and then later actually it's written down and it developed into a novel. So because compared to the novel I look at, this another type of Korean novel has a lot more oralities or oral tradition there. So because of that, actually scholars heavily interested in Panzori's orality a lot. But the Chinese poetry orality in the novel I look at, actually it's often not studied that much. So I think, so there is another kind of orality we should think about. This is the way the Panzori is performed. But anyway, so this is actually my last PowerPoint slides. So first I raised the different orality. Is first the orality in text performed by characters in the novel, which is orality of Chinese poetry. Second, text recited by audiences. Text means prose plus orality of Chinese poetry. And then usually prose in Korean and verse in Chinese, recited by the audiences. And these two orality, actually scholarly awareness of the first and second, is relatively not enough when compared to Panzori. So I think the reason I have divided up in two or three, because the first orality is given by the author, right? Author write down the poetry in the novel. So orality is given by the author. But the second orality actually is realized by the audiences, right? But third one, actually, these two, or the first and second oralities, actually I think it's important to recognize these oralities also important, because we don't recognize orality, actually, we don't discuss it. So that's why I added the last one. So scholarly attention actually is not given too much, enough to the orality of Chinese poetry and the text recited by audiences as well. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much for this.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
So you should, yes, you should have stop screen sharing just in front of you.
Yeah, I don't know why, but okay.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. That was really interesting and fascinating. I really have a lot of questions, but let's first move on to our second speakers, Henry, who's completing his MPhil in English Studies at Oxford, and much of his research has been on late medieval classical reception, and his MPhil dissertation examines is a comparative study of medieval song lyric from Western Europe and China. And today he will talk about layers of orality within one of a famous Chaucer's novel. So I leave it to you.
Thanks, Familia. Thank you. And thank you, Yeonsu, for your fascinating talk. I'll just try and figure out the screen sharing myself. Okay, I think, no, this is the best, I think. Okay, can you see a PowerPoint there? Yeah, okay, good. So, yeah, I'd like to start by thanking the ETC board, not only for inviting me to speak, which is very nice, but also just for coming up with such a brilliant topic, which I think has just been so so useful to think about from an interdisciplinary perspective. And I've loved all of the sessions so far, and I'm looking forward to the next ones. And I found them really, the ones we've had so far, really useful for thinking more about my topic and reframing the way that I approach it. But most of all, with Yeonsu, I've found it so helpful having conversations with her over the past few weeks. And I'll touch on some of the fruits of those conversations, hopefully, at the end of this talk. So many of you will have heard of Geoffrey Chaucer. He's famous for writing the Canterbury Tales. I won't talk about them too much today because it's 6th week and it would be tiring to try and get through that. But he was a public servant alive in the latter half of the 14th century. Today, I'm going to focus not on the Canterbury Tales, but on the work he wrote immediately before it in the 1380s, Troilus and Crusade. Set in the Trojan War and detailing Troilus's tragic fortunes in love, this roughly 8,000 line poem is in many ways archetypally literate. I'm going to refer to the I of the text as a narrator today for simplicity, though it's worth considering that if a text is publicly performed, narration becomes a more complex and extra-textual process than it is in the novel, for example. And A.C. Spearing has recently written probingly on narration in Chaucer's period, if you'd like to read more about this. I put a reference on my bibliography for A.C. Spearing on that. Just because if there are any medievalists present, they'll probably get funny if I talk about a narrator, because it's quite controversial to talk, but just for simplicity, that's what I'll talk about today. So the narrator relentlessly reminds us of the work's textual sources: Dares, Dictys, Virgil, Ovid, Homer, Lucan, Statius, and even one source that Chaucer invents and calls Lollius. The first stanza of the proem or prologue ends with the narrator declaring, "I weep as I write." Clearly, Troilus is a written text, which paints itself as having been produced in consultation with written sources. See these pictures of the scholarly reader as the narrator presents himself frequently in Troilus, with many texts open at once on the desk or on a book wheel. This is a far cry from orality, of course. These pictures present writing as a solitary reading practice. So yeah, some of our favorite writers like Petrarch, Cicero. If you'd like to see which manuscripts they come from, there's the website there by Eric Quackel, which is a great source for fun pictures from manuscripts from this period. At first glance then, it may seem bizarre that the proem ends with a very different image to that of the scholarly writer. The narrator says, "Now listen with a good intention, with a good heart, for I will go straight to my matter, in which you may hear the double sorrows of Troilus." No longer a scholarly bookworm weeping as they write, the narrator is now presenting themselves as speaking to a listening audience of more than one reader, as is indicated by the second person plural pronoun ye. This inconsistency, in which Troilus is presented at once as a written and as an orally delivered text, runs relentlessly through the poem and has caused no end of controversy among Chaucer scholars. Until recently, the critical orthodoxy was to dismiss the intimations of oral performance as mere relics of an oral performance culture that was already obsolete by Chaucer's time. Scholars wanted to see private reading as the real technology of Troilus. These critics might point to a scene in which Pandarus, Crusade's uncle, is described as sitting down by the fire alone, quote, as if to look upon an old romance, a scene which suggests that Chaucer imagines reading as a private activity. On the other hand, though, another scene in the poem depicts Crusade and a group of handmaidens engaging in public reading. He found her, Pandarus, found her and two other ladies sitting in a tiled parlour, and the three of them heard a maiden read them the story of the siege of Thebes for as long as they wished. Pandarus apologizes for interrupting this, saying, I'm sorry that I've got in the way of you listening to your book. It's worth noting in passing that public reading here is presented as a domestic and noble activity, and I haven't come across the sort of more like marketplace public readings that Yeonsu has mentioned went on in the Korean context. Public reading thus means reading among a generally small group of people rather than in an outdoor public context. End of side note. Again, then, we have an internal contradiction in the text. Both public and private reading are presented as possibilities in the world of Troilus. Critics like Joyce Coleman have in recent decades worked towards demonstrating that these forms of reading, public and private, were not mutually exclusive in the late medieval period. One could read alone like Pandarus, though accounts of reading at the time suggest that public reading was considered preferable as being more communal, more conducive to conversation, and more fun. Some critics until Joyce Coleman had assumed that public reading was for illiterate listeners, but actually whether or not you're literate, in this period it's preferred to read publicly. The capaciousness, Coleman finds evidence that after having a book publicly read, its owner might go and read it privately to peruse it more closely, or to use it as a scholarly source like the narrator does in Troilus. So the capaciousness of the idea of reading in late medieval England is demonstrated by the capaciousness of the word reader in Middle English. As Ad Putter demonstrates, someone reading alone was a reader, like this griffin monk figure on the left. But equally, someone reading publicly to a group is a reader. Someone hearing a text read aloud was a reader, and even someone reciting without the aid of a written text was a reader. See on the right, this reader figure on the frontispiece of the Corpus Christi Cambridge Troilus manuscript. This figure, some people think is Chaucer, but whether or regardless, what I only noticed a few days ago, which is really my ignorance, because people have mentioned this before in papers, is that the reader doesn't have a text. And on the bottom right, you see that zoomed in. And yet in Middle English, that reader could be counted as a reader despite not having a book. So oral performance was thus widespread and standard in late medieval England, but it's intriguing that it was not sharply distinguished from private reading. As we've seen, Troilus and Crusade alternately imagines itself in terms of private and public reading. Thus, the poem is oral in the sense that it could be, and most likely often was, publicly performed. It's not oral in the sense of being orally transmitted, like the Homeric poems, or at least like some scholars think the Homeric poems were. As the narrator makes clear, the text of Troilus is written based on an earlier written on earlier written accounts of the Trojan War. Nevertheless, the text evinces a number of features that Walter Ong associates with orally transmitted texts, chief among them formulae. In my undergraduate dissertation, I looked at a group of formulae in Chaucer that include the words no more, I can no more say, I can no more, there is no more to say. Chaucer uses a handful of phrases like this as verse formulae. Not only this, but he uses them in a dynamic way that reminded me of Homeric formulae. In particular, his use of no more formulae, as I call them, reflects the recent argument of Barbara Graziosi and Johannes Hobolt, building on the work of John Foley, that Homeric formulae, or traditional phrases as they prefer to call them, point the audience towards resonances and dissonances between a particular use of the formula and its use at other points in the poem. For example, calling Achilles swift-footed even when he's sitting immobile in the Greek camp is not redundant. Instead, it highlights the incongruence of the situation. The dynamism of Chaucer's use of no more formulae is hard to sum up briefly, but I'll try to give you at least a flavor of it. Through the use of the formulae in contexts of the inexorability of fortune, and in contexts of the need for the narrator to follow his sources, Chaucer involves what A.C. Spearing calls the poem's, quote, story of the very process of retelling in the tragedy of the plot. The denouement of the tragedy is punctuated by Pandarus's repeated use of no more formulae. The last words spoken by a character, in fact, in the whole of the poem are Pandarus's I can no more say, capping a speech which begins desperately with another no more formula, expressing Pandarus's distress at his inability to remedy Troilus's fortune. My brother dear, I may do for you no more. What should I say? Pandarus's first speech of this final book, another exasperated attempt to console Troilus, likewise contains a no more formula. And that's here. I can no more, but whoever will not believe advice or teaching, I can see in him no remedy. Because Troilus is ignoring Pandarus's attempts to teach him how to solve this unsolvable situation. Like Pandarus, the narrator uses no more formulae to capture a sense of the irremediability of the tragic direction of fortune in the poem. In Book 3, there's a cluster of uses of the formula I can no more, both by the desperate Troilus twice and by the narrator 3 times, reflecting the impossibility of the narrator changing the run of fortune as fortune's wheel reaches its apex. Of his protagonists, the narrator says, I can no more, but sometime I must, following my auctor, my source, tell their gladness, as well as I have told their heaviness. The narrator is as tied to his auctor as Troilus is tied to his fortune. The formula registers the narrator's reluctance to move forward in the narrative, presumably out of a wish not to reach the renewed and redoubled heaviness of its end. No more formulae thus enfold the narrator, the public reader of this text, in the poem's sense of tragic helplessness. Auctor, a word that becomes our modern author, but in Middle English means authority figure and source, is a term that is deeply tied to written texts and their preservation of the authoritative writings of ancient auctors. This shows the extent of Chaucer's integration of literate and oral ideas of literature. He uses a formula to draw attention to the narrator's reliance on written textuality and authority for the story being told. The most surprising aspect of these no more formulae, though, is that Chaucer appears to have invented them. If anyone has any potential source for these formulae, I'd be really grateful if they'd let me know. But I've yet to find any text, orally derived or not, that uses no more formulae. True, phrases like "I can no more say" are present in Middle English romances, and they're used by Chaucer's friend and poetic contemporary, John Gower. But in these other texts, "no more" phrases are never used with the frequency or consistency of shape to be called formulae. The only other poet I've found using "no more" phrases as formulae is John Lydgate, a monk from Bury who was and remains famous for the strong influence Chaucer had on his verse. Evidently, Lydgate read Chaucer and appreciated the use of these no more formulae enough to adopt them in his own work. In fact, Lydgate uses these formulae even more frequently than Chaucer himself. None of Lydgate's contemporaries do the same, which suggests that Lydgate's source for them is not a common tradition of orally derived literature, but is Chaucer's own work. We have this odd case, then, of Chaucer inventing a type of verse formula and these formulae being picked up by another literate poet. It seems that one need not work in an orally transmitted tradition to be able to be creative with formulae or even to transmit them to later poets. The no more formulae of Chaucer and Lydgate can thus hardly be called oral residue in Walter Ong's terms. They are not an obsolescent oral feature, but are the product of written poets innovating on the way that oral texts work. I gratefully borrow this idea of oral text working differently to literate texts from Stephen Coleman in our first session. I'd be interested to hear what people think about this. Does it mean perhaps that some oral features, some ways we imagine orally derived texts as working differently to literate ones, have just as much to do with oral performance as with oral transmission? I'm not sure, perhaps. Chaucer and Lydgate seem to understand the potential of formulae in producing the resonance and dissonance that Graziosi and Hobart theorize for Homeric formulae, despite the fact that the narratorial voices in Chaucer and Lydgate are very vocal about their reliance on written sources and their composition by writing. All of these observations demonstrate that Chaucer doesn't seem to think in terms of a dichotomy of literate and oral literature. The narrator of Troilus says farewell to their little book, imagining that it will be read or else sung. See the last two lines of this quotation. So read or else sung. Crusade similarly imagines in the last book of the poem that she will be written or sung about. Troilus and Crusade thus seems not to be an intrinsically oral or literate text. It relentlessly imagines itself as both oral and literate at once. And I suppose this shouldn't come as a surprise, given that writing and memorization were twin technologies in Middle English romance, both before Chaucer and during his lifetime. In a paper I reference on my handout, Ad Putter argues that minstrels memorized written texts and then performed them and then altered them in oral transmission. So if Ong is fond of the narrative that orality was becoming obsolete while literacy triumphed, it doesn't seem that Chaucer's contemporaries were aware of this process. Instead, 14th century writings show a deep-set bibliophilia, which is married to a love of public reading. Troilus is an example of oral techniques like formulae being a central aspect of written texts, not as a residue of orality, but as an alive part of writing poetry. Before I finish, I'd like to quickly respond to some aspects of Yeonsu's paper that I found particularly thought-provoking. First of all, I'm drawn to her idea of orality as something that connects people. In late medieval English studies, scholars like David Lawton, Anne Middleton, and Joyce Coleman have argued that it's public reading and the features associated with it that produce a public voice or common voice in late medieval England, engaged in constructing a public sphere that could enable discussion of both mundane and political issues. Some of you may be familiar with the arguments that go on between the pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales. The narrator in Troilus and Crusade suggests a similar communality and conversational quality to the imagined public performance of Troilus. Here are some examples. But now perhaps someone will be waiting for me. This is the narrator speaking. But now perhaps someone will be waiting for me to rehearse every word or sound or look or facial expression of Troilus throughout this period to his dear lady. I believe that would take a long time to hear. So here Chaucer has the narrator anticipate the requests and desires of a listening audience. At other points, the narrator anticipates the listeners getting rowdier. If it happens in any way that there is any lover here in this place who hears, as the story describes, how Troilus came into the favor of his lady and thinks, I wouldn't win love by doing that, or marvels at his words or his deeds, I don't know. But to me, it's nothing to marvel at. For every person who went to Rome did not always hold the same path or method. Also, there are scarcely 3 people in this place who have said and done entirely the same thing in love. Here's a final example where the narrator encourages debate among the listeners. So in that one, he was trying to tamp down debate. In this one, more encouraging it. But now to you, you lovers that are here, was Troilus not in a predicament? What should he say? So at this point, Troilus is pretending to be ill and is about to finally meet Crusade in person for the first time. And so he's planned something to say, but suddenly gets really nervous because she's about to walk in. In passages like these, we see Chaucer anticipating a boisterous and involved group of readers arguing amongst themselves about Troilus's mode of winning Crusade's love, and also about how the story should be told. There's no reason not to believe that real debates and complaints like these could have taken place during public readings of texts like Troilus. And this clearly would encourage a sense of public reading as a communal and collectivizing activity, drawing people together, just as Yeogeun argues for the song, the first song she mentioned in the novel. Second, Troilus and Crusade reflects the importance of song to the orality of Yeogeun's material. As I have touched upon, the poem is frequently imagined as being sung. The narrator, in particular, repeatedly calls the text a song. The poem includes many inset lyrics as well, prompting David Wallace to compare it to an opera. Many of the songs are introduced by the narrator, who says, here you will hear the song just as it was sung by the character, and is very insistent on this idea that you will hear the song as it was originally, which creates another aspect of the performativity of this text, imagining the person publicly reading as the character and the listeners as the audience of the character's song. Yeogeun points out that in Nine Cloud Dream, songs are central to the development of the relationship between the monk and the women, helping to bring about the women's enamorment. Similarly, in Troilus and Crusade, it's Crusade hearing her cousin Antigone sing a song about love that sets her on the course to fall in love with Troilus. After hearing the song, Crusade asks who wrote it, then asks, Lord, is there such bliss among these lovers as they are able to well describe? Which sets up a discussion about the nature of love, with Antigone asking, but do you believe that every wretch knows the perfect bliss of love? Why, no, indeed. They believe anything is love if one is lustful. Stop, stop. They know nothing about this. People need to ask saints if it's pleasant in heaven. Why? Because they can tell. And ask fiends, is it foul in hell? This is the sort of discussion we see the narratorial voice everywhere imagining for the audience of Troilus and Crusade itself. Crusade's response speaks volumes about the way that orality and literacy are imagined as working in concert in this text. Every word that she heard from her, as in from Antigone, she began to engrave securely onto her heart, and incrementally, love began to frighten her less than it did before, and to sink into her heart, so that she became somewhat able to convert. Crusade hears these words in the song and in the subsequent discussion, and these result in an engraving on her heart, a symbol of memorization and also of falling in love, and a symbol suggestive of writing. So both oral and literate technologies, if we can really imagine them as separate at all, are central to Crusade's enamorment, as is the dialogue prompted by Antigone's song, which recalls the dialogue set up by the public reading that we saw just a moment ago. So Yeonsu's thinking about the way that the orality of song draws characters together in her novel has made me see the dynamic interplay of orality, literacy, and public reading in the way that song is imagined in Troilus and Crusade. In the case of Antigone's song, this interplay is indeed an engine of connecting characters, particularly through convincing them that love is ennobling and that it has a power, as Troilus sings in his second song of the poem, to circle all hearts and bind them fast. So to conclude, this power comes through the oral, sung performance of songs, but as in the case of Yeonsu's novel, orality is imbued with literacy and vice versa. Whereas Yeonsu's songs are in the style of Tang Dynasty poems, the two songs Troilus sings are translations. The first song is the first ever translation of a Petrarchan sonnet into English. The second song is a translation of a song from Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, a Latin philosophical work from late antiquity. One could hardly imagine more bookish sources for Troilus's songs. Thinking through aspects of Yeonsu's research in this way has helped me to appreciate how inextricably linked and effortlessly fused orality and literacy are in late medieval English literature. Thank you. And I'll stop.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Perry. That was brilliant, and thank you both for these incredible contributions. So I will now hold the joint discussion session open, and I will give you a few seconds to just recollect all these incredible information. And this is what I meant with intent. And then maybe think about questions, comments, or even bibliographical references that you would like to share with Harry or Sue. So in the meantime, I will please allow me to sort of recap briefly, because your multi-layers, your analysis of multi-layers orality was very different, even though Harry's one was indeed affected by what Sue presented. So in the first case, we have this, I call internal and external orality. So these two layers, and the first one is sort of internal because it is given by the author of the text, and the external one, which you identify, is given by the audience, like we say, and then at the end you sort of add a third layer, which is something that you say scholar attention is very low, as if compared to Korean vernacular song. And I was wondering, why do you think this is a third layer, or do you think this is simply another sort of feedback that scholars have concerning this text? And then, well, for Henry, you already sort of answer my question, because my question was how did Sue's work influence your reading of the text? Because you, as you told me in private conversation, you said I wanted to focus on formulaic language within the text, but then Sue's work was sort of illuminating And maybe, I don't know, maybe if you want to elaborate on this, yes.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was really just making me think of orality in a different way, because when I first worked on the formulae in Chaucer when I was an undergraduate, I was mostly thinking of it in terms of Homer and in terms of the debates surrounding Homer, to do with the question of, well, to do with questions of like oral transmission rather than oral performance, and also particularly focusing on things like formulae, literary features that are maybe more associated with orally transmitted texts. So really talking to Yonsu just made me have to think more about the problem of, or not problem, but about public performance as a factor in kind of trying to make sense of those aspects of Troilus and Crusade that we might at first think look a bit more like features that we're used to seeing in orally derived literature. Yeah, so it kind of broadened my approach, which I think has actually been really useful, not only just in making me think more broadly about the question, but also in how I've approached the formulae, because I hadn't really thought before about how it works that Chaucer gets to the point of using formulae in the creative way he does. I think I'd kind of assumed more that it was just that he was picking up on a Romance tradition that did use formulae. But it's made me think, well, how much of the effectiveness of formulae is down to oral performance rather than like simply oral transmission? So yeah, it's just made me think about the problems in different ways.
But also, I mean, when it comes to formulae, it could simply be a like literary some strategy, like a technology, literary technology. And it seems like Chaucer, it's like you say, seems like Chaucer is playing with it to make it more dynamic.
Yeah,
So,
no, I agree. And yeah, what I found strangest is that when he's writing this, his contemporaries don't seem to be using formulae in the same way. So it's really quite odd. Yeah, no, I agree. Really made me rethink what formulae can be good for, other than just like memorization and oral transmission. Yeah.
thank you. And Siri, would you like to?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the reason I add one more layer there, actually, I think although the author composed literary work, I think the it's always the audience or readers who get the meaning out of it, or also who get the orality of the text they actually realize in the hand of in the voice of audiences. So that's why I thought this orality of a Chinese poetry, actually it's coming from Tang poetry oral tradition, and it's there, it's given by the author, and it's performed by the characters. That's for sure. That's given by the author, but actually there's another layers performed by the reciter, or the readers, and then the last one, the scholarly attention means that actually the scholars, I think, is also another kind of very sophisticated readers. So it's one of the audiences, in relation to the text, I think. So when the scholars recognize orality of the text, and then the orality actually realized or performed, or in different way. Scholars don't read out, but anyway, in a different way. So that's why I add another layer there. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, now I understand that. So Tasha has a follow-up on this, maybe?
Yeah, thanks both for your really interesting discussion. My question was for Yongsoo, just about, you mentioned this Korean vernacular tradition being so strong. So I was wondering what bearing this would have for the text you're discussing, because clearly it would have been read in Sino-Xenic readings. I was just wondering whether people would have maybe rejected this whilst reading it out loud. So choosing to say stuff like saram instead of in, for example, and just having the Korean native words be spoken with this Chinese text. I was wondering if that was a phenomenon that occurred at all.
So means that the poetry or the...
Yeah, like when reading the poetry, instead of doing the borrowing word from Chinese, if people would translate it into the native Korean word whilst reading it.
Oh, okay. So I don't think they actually translate the poetry in Korean, because they it's really familiar for them to read out the Chinese text, because they have a classical training. They read a lot of Chinese classics from early age, and then it includes a lot of Tang poetry or other Chinese poetry. So actually the reading out the poetry is really part of their core education. So maybe that's the reason why when they read Chinese poetry, they never translate. They just read them out. And then the reason because there's evidence, because as I said, this novel, we never know which version is first, but there's two different versions, Chinese version and Korean version. Korean version is translation of, when the Chinese first, Korean is translation of Chinese. But when the Korean first, probably Chinese is the translation of Korean. But we never know, but scholars actually think that maybe Chinese version is first. But there's no evidence for that, because the author's manuscripts didn't survive. So that's why. But when you look at the Korean version, the Chinese poetry actually it didn't translate. It just transliterate in Korean. So that's one of the evidence. Actually, when they read out, actually Chinese poetry, it doesn't translate.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
If I could just use my speaker's privilege to just like butt in, that I was so interested by this, what you were saying, Yeonsu, about how they would translate while reading, like to the listeners.
Mm-hmm.
And actually yesterday, I came across an article which talks about a similar phenomenon in public reading in late medieval England. So there was some Latin at the beginning, and then the rest would be in English, but you needed to have a reader in your household, like one who had the training to be able to read really complex Latin and to translate that for you in the process of reading. But this is just like a side point, how it's another affinity that I hadn't noticed before. Yeah. And that if anyone's interested in looking at that article, it's by Joyce Coleman and it's in my bibliography.
Thank you, Harry. So we have a new question from Sophia.
Yes, thank you, Youngsoo and Harry, for very engaging papers. I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about songs, what these songs are like that accompany the poems. Just as a a modern listener, when I think of song, that concept brings up probably very different features than would be present for these songs and in the context that you mentioned. So if you could talk about that, and also if you have any anything that any references that I can look at to read more about it. Thank you.
Okay, the Chinese poetry you said about, the Chinese poetry. So let me, can I share a screen a bit, because I have something, probably it's better to show something rather than just describe it, explaining verbally. So, okay. Okay, let me share the screen. Sorry, my a lot of mess. But anyway, so let me just get this a bit bigger. No, not this one. So the poem I showed, these poems, actually I kind of thought about maybe I include this in my presentation, but it's too technical. That's why I didn't. So for example, the poem basically, this is a rhyme. So the last character in the second line and the last character in the first line has a rhyme. And also there's a two different, so let me just read this because it's kind of too complicated to explain. So the first willow poem by Soyu observes the versification of the second form above. Second form means that there's a 4 different forms at least. So there's a two, let me skip this because it doesn't make sense here. So for example, basically there's a two different, the sound, ping song and jaw song. So ping song means here is a, when you see here, so we have a 5 for each character is different, but Chinese character belong to groups, either ping song or jaw song. So that's why here we have ping jaw, right? Ping jaw, ping jaw, jaw, ping. So as you know, Chinese, there's a 4 different sound. But the first 3 goes to ping song. And then the last one is go jaw song. So there's 2 groups, ping and jaw. So you can choose, you have to select correct character to in each character, and then you have to consider this rhyme too. And then there's more to explain, but that's just about it. So if you know Chinese, probably this Lu and Liu, here actually Lu and Liu, it's line. So it kind of similar to English poems, right? It's a similar vowel sound here. I mean, the first, this consonant doesn't matter. It happened to be same, but actually the vowel sound should be similar or the same. Okay, that's it.
Should we let the follow-up go for Ray's follow-up?
Yeah, I was just about to say, we have 2 follow-ups. The first one is from Ray, and the second one is still from Sophia.
Yeah.
I noticed that in these 2 poems, the first 2 characters or the first 3 characters are the same when you compare the 2 poems. So my question is, I mean, is that somewhat formulaic? I mean, your translation doesn't show that as much because
No.
looking at, and I don't know Chinese, so I mean, there's a lot I don't know here. But if that's the case, then I guess one of my questions is this 2 poems or is this 2 versions of 1 poem?
No, it's 2 poems. So so there's 4 different types poems at least. So there's this 4 lines is 1 poem, and this another 4 line is another poem, and each line has 5 characters.
I get here's my question. If we understand multiformity as something that occurs in oral traditions, is this 2 different poems, or is it the same poem in 2 different versions that allows for the variation at the end of the line? Do you understand my question?
Oh no, actually it's 2 different poems.
Okay.
It's 1 poem and it's another poem. So it's not a variation. It's 2 different poems.
Is there a reason, Yeonsu, why they start with the same characters, the lines in the 2 different poems?
Oh, okay. Because that's why it's a bit confusing. Oh, now I got it. So I never thought that it's gonna start with the same willow. Oh, okay. Because it's about willow. The poems are about willow. That's why it starts with a willow. But
then in the following lines as well, how the second line of each one and the third line of each one.
Oh, right. Oh my God. I just made a mistake. Sorry. Sorry.
No, don't worry.
Oh, that's the reason. Yeah, this is the poem here. Here, and this one is different, right?
But the first 2 characters are the same.
The first
Yeah,
2
first
characters are the same.
willow.
Yeah.
It's willow.
In the second line, the first 3 characters are the same. The third line, the first 2 characters are the same. The third line, the first 3 characters are the same.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm asking, is it 1 poem in 2 versions, or is it 2 poems?
It's 2 poems. I mean, most scholars say that it's 2 poems. But it happened to be very overlapped there. Yeah, because it's about the willow. And because this willow and this is a tree. This tree. Yeah, I know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't actually never thought about there's a lot of same characters there.
So I think Sophia has a follow-up on this as well.
Yeah, so I was just trying to understand when you started out, what you were showing us with the rhyming of the sounds. Are you saying that there's similar lexical tone for there are patterns that are being exploited for lexical tone?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So the rhyme it doesn't have to be a tone, but this ping and joy is tone. So different tones. So you know the Chinese has a tonal language. They have different tones. So this ping and joy actually is divided according to the tones. Yeah. That rhyme doesn't matter. Yeah.
That's a part of the nature of the song. Is that what you're saying? Is that a part of the nature of the song? Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Was there another follow-up?
So there is someone, I think Mary. Yes, so Mary asks, who is the author of these 2 Tang poems and were they composed by the novel author himself?
Oh, I mean, so far, it's people, I mean, the scholars think that actually it's composed by the author of the novel. So it's entirely his composition, the author Kim Man-jung of the novel.
Okay, so then.
So I should answer Sophia's as well, right?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, not at all. No, I know it's because there's been so many follow-ups. Yeah, no, really good question. And I'll send references afterwards because I think your email was on your handout, I think. So the songs in Troilus and Crusade. Now, even though he says, oh, you're going to hear it just as it was, like just as it was sung at this time, actually, he doesn't give any, there's no music in it. And he doesn't even change the verse form. So these actual songs themselves, it's difficult to say in terms of like musical content, what kind of thing Chaucer had in mind. I mean, probably what he's thinking is that in the 14th century, earlier in the 14th century, there were French poets, particularly Machaut, who is Chaucer's hero, who wrote books that included songs with written music inside. So they're very kind of, you know, multimedia. And so Chaucer maybe fancies himself as being like that, so puts in these songs, but it doesn't seem that Chaucer had any of that kind of musical training that he could put in any actual music. So that's as far as the music of those songs. There is actually a book, and I'll send you the reference for this, that argues that some of Chaucer's songs that he writes, I don't think this particularly applies to Troilus and Crusade, but some of the other ones, it argues that he might have intended them to be sung to a tune that was current in French songs at the time, and gives you the music for those tunes, which is quite cool. In terms of the content of the songs and the strangeness of that, I don't know. I mean, the first song is from Petrarch, so it's what you'd expect from Petrarch. It's called, the first line is, if no love is, oh God, what feel I so? So if love doesn't exist, then why do I feel like this? And it's kind of a soliloquy sort of thing on how he feels really bad, but is wondering, oh, but what if love doesn't exist? You know, this kind of thing. So that, I don't know, I feel like some of the songs in Troilus and Crusade are actually not too far from what we're used to, at least when they're dealing with love, except they have a big concern with the idea of love as being virtuous. So the second song that I mentioned, Antigone's song, the whole thing is about how love has like an ennobling power. And then at the end, there's a Boethian song from that late antique philosophical work. That one's probably a bit stranger. It's a bit more like a hymn to love, about love being this kind of ennobling and encircling power. So that's quite strange. But I'll send some references along, and that's a really great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And so Bernardo had to leave, but he's asking something that I was actually very interested in as well, which is the social aspect of these two texts. And he asks, what about the social level and literacy of audiences of these two highly literate corpora?
Yeah, I think Yeonsu, your answer to that will be probably even more interesting than mine. So I'll let you go first.
You go first.
Oh, okay, sure. Okay, we'll save yours for last, because I think Yeonsu's text is actually more interesting in this respect, in terms of the class question. I'm not an expert on this, but the impression I get is that Chaucer was writing with an aristocratic audience in mind. And you can see in the frontispiece behind me at the top, I mentioned, like, before people started coming in, there's like two royal figures at the top. So there's a lot of interest in the kind of noble patrons that he had, who in this period were interested in English poetry, given a kind of what you could call English nationalism during like the 100 Years' War. But there's also evidence, particularly after Chaucer's death. I mean, pretty much all of our, I think all of our manuscripts are from after Chaucer's death. So it's difficult really with the nature of the evidence to say, but it seems that more and more there was interest from mercantile backgrounds in Chaucer's texts. So even though most of the depictions we have and the accounts we have of public reading in Chaucer's lifetime are more to do with nobility, it seems that it becomes more widespread, this idea of reading out loud for a group among lower class groups as well. Yeah, but actually it's really interesting question, because like I said, that there's a lot of scholars had thought that public reading was associated with illiteracy, when actually throughout the 15th century, so 100 years after Chaucer dies, it's still the most widespread mode of reading, it seems, even in noble circles. It's only in the 16th century, perhaps as a result of printing making books more widespread, I'm not sure really. In the 16th century, public reading becomes more associated with illiteracy. But in Chaucer's period, no. So anyway, that's an aside, and I'll let Yeogeun get onto the more interesting answer.
Thank you, Harry.
Okay. I'm kind of a bit a pressure to be very interesting with my answer, but anyway, so the novel I discussed today is really one of the popular novel. So it gained a popularity across society. So from the king to the lowly class people. So obviously the king, I mean, he has a highly literate, but often, and it's also kind of social, I mean, more cultural context probably. So, I mean, because the dynasty I look at is called Joseon. I mean, from 14th to 19th century, late 19th century. It's called Joseon dynasty. And then, so there's a records, I mean, history record. So it's about the king, what they do, what they did, and how they govern the country, things like that. I mean, there's a huge records. And then from the record, we found that actually the king often have his courtiers, or the what is called eunuchs. Is it the word? The attendants, I mean, near him, they all have them to read out the novel to him. So like a bedtime story, or when he was not well, he needs some kind of light reading materials. But rather than he read himself, often have others read them out to him. But not just the king. I mean, even in the noble family or other family, I mean, the parents often have their children they read a novel out loud to them. So that means that actually, as the Harry said, not always literacy or illiteracy kind of division. I mean, in terms of the reading out the novel. So, but definitely illiterate people, actually, they often go to the market, as I showed earlier, the painting, and then they listen to someone else reading out the novel to them. And also the poetry I mentioned, actually, I didn't go further, I mean, in details, but when the printing is more available, these books are printed, and often to make it more profitable, they shorten the content of the novel, and also, I mean, often it's the case that the poetry or Chinese references, I mean, that is kind of cut out, discarded, because the readers at that time and towards the 19th century, actually, they don't care about these highly what is that? Very highly literate Chinese influence.
So thank you so much both for this, and we have time for James, if you're still there.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Thank you.
Excellent. It's weird being a disembodied voice, so I'm going to risk video. I haven't got any Wi-Fi, so I'm hotspotting off my phone, but fingers crossed. Thank you very much again. Reiterate for both those talks. Really interesting and enjoyable, and dovetailed really well. I was thinking largely off the back of what you said, Harry. You were saying, Harry, about reader being a kind of a multifarious thing, but I think, I'd be interested to hear both of your thoughts on this, which is, how do you think the I guess literary effects of formulaic language or other kinds of repetition would differ based on whether that you were hearing them as an earworm versus flicking back through the pages of a manuscript, for instance?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Yeah, I think you notice it more. I'm not sure. I suppose you can notice these things when you're just reading it on the page, but you would imagine, particularly with the kind of formulae I'm talking about, where it's there is no more to say, things like that. When you're actually speaking, when someone's performing it, you'd imagine that they would like pause or something, or make more of it performatively than you would if you're just kind of reading through it. So I imagine that it could be more of a structural device to show you when you're getting to points where particularly the characters are kind of up against fortune and things are out of control. Yeah, so I think that's, in that way, it's probably easier to notice, but I don't know, we'll have to do a public reading of Troilus and Crusade. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Yeah, some proper field work.
Yeah. Exactly.
Now we do anthropology.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I mean, I kind of read the novel again. I mean, there's a different versions, although I only introduced the 1725 versions. So I mean, obviously the novel was written by the author Kim Man-jung first, but after that, the common practice back then is actually the printing is kind of very costly in Korea. So people hand copy the texts. I mean, as in Europe too. I mean, they hand copied and to make their own copy, and then through that process, people change the content and add something they want and just discard something they don't like to see there. And also, as I said, this text is performed into or the audience, right, in the market, in public reading. And then I just noticed that because of that, towards the 19th century, we noticed that we see some kind of formulae, because initially there's no such like that. But from this kind of public reading and recitation, I mean, this recitation actually written down. And then the text went through a bit of change. Yeah, which makes sense, right?
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't going to add anything. I just wanted to remark.
Remark that it was very interesting and very intense, as I said.
Yeah.
No, this was very brilliant, both your contributions and the discussion. So thank you so much, Henry and Suri, and thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. And we hope to see you next week for our 5th session, which is going to be of comparative methods. So it's going to be very interesting as well. And yeah, have a lovely evening. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
thank you very much again, guys. Thank you.